I told you what we were going to be looking at today. We're going to take a little bit closer look at geopolitical realism and world systems theory. And I think I mentioned, but I'll reinforce this. If you look at those two links, it looks like they're incredibly long and complicated. But if you just look at the first couple of paragraphs of each one of those, you'll have a really good introduction into what each of those theories is. So that's all you really need to do, okay? But first of all, somebody tell me when we say geopolitical realism, what do we mean by realism? Realism in what sense? Oh, come on. You knew you were going to have to do this. You guys didn't stay up watching the election all night. Come on now. Or if you did, you played cruel drinking games. But no, you guys don't, whatever you guys are, we're post-millennials, you guys don't drink. It's really, I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know if I trust people who don't drink. I don't know.
So for geopolitical realism, so like I skimmed through the two different ones, and it seems like, I don't know, it, at least with geopolitical realism, it's like focusing on like the states kind of thing, rather than like in comparison to like a cooperation kind of thing between like a bunch of different things. But I'm not explaining it well.
Well, no, but you're going in the right direction. If you want to understand geopolitical realism, the first thing you do is exactly what Kennedy suggested. You start with the state. Okay. In other words, you don't look at culture. You don't look at ethnicity. You don't look at differences within the state. You look at the state as what's called a unitary rational actor. Okay. So you are focused on the states as individual actors. But more importantly, and this again is another element of what Kennedy suggested, is you look at them as competitive actors. Okay. Their rationality is motivated by the desire to win. Okay. And so what it does is it moves us away from this idea of cooperation. This theory in its purest form, if you look at, say, I don't know, Hans Morgenthau and the real hardcore realists of the early to mid 20th century, right? They would have you believe that, look, the world, first of all, is anarchic. And you'll notice, well, maybe you won't, but if you don't, I'll mention it anyway. There's a philosopher by the name of Thomas Hobbes who described life in the state of nature, which is essentially what realists think of as the international environment, as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Okay? Not unlike myself. And the idea there is that, look, everyone is insecure. Everyone is vulnerable. Everyone is worried about surviving. And as a consequence of that, the rationality in the international system is what's called Hobbesian. That is, it's a war of all against all. Now, the word war doesn't necessarily mean a constant state of armed, combat, okay? But what it means is there's this constant sense of striving, of power against power. That's, and again, I'm using maybe a little fancier language, but that's essentially what Kennedy was saying, is you don't look at cooperation. You look at contestation, and you look at struggles over power. And if you want to understand the world, and more importantly, if you want to be able to predict what's liable to happen under certain circumstances in the world, the predicate of all of that is it's not cooperation, it's contestation, it's collision, it's combat, and other things that start with C. Okay? Does that make sense? What do you think about that as a way of understanding the world? It sounds kind of brutal, but again, if you've studied any Machiavelli, for example, Machiavelli is kind of a post-moralist, at least in The Prince. He's not talking about morality. He's talking about dealing with the world as it is. Machiavelli is also often invoked when people talk about geopolitical realism. Does that seem accurate? Does it seem pathological? Does it seem, what do you think? I'm actually asking for your opinion.
I think it's a very like older way to think about it, like older as in like the starting of nations. Like I think of, Europe defining its borders. I think of Prince, obviously. Um, so I think that, or the Prince is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And so it's just like, it's very watch out for your own back and don't pay attention to other people, but like care about yourself, because the only way that you're going to succeed is if you care about yourself. So I think that that theory still resides in some places, like little, but I think it's more so like an older theory that like I could see it really being beneficial back in those days when states were becoming entities.
Well, we got to keep a couple of things in mind that complicate the argument a little bit. And one of them is that for a theory to function, it has to function as an explanatory mechanism. It has to be the best explanation. Evolution through natural selection is not a belief, it's a theory. As far as we know, it is the best theory to fit all available data on the evidence of the origin and transformation and evolution of species. There isn't a better theory to compete with it. So when we're talking about realism as a theory, the idea is not, well, that might have worked at one time, but it doesn't work now. The question is, does it still function now? When we look at China, or we look at Russia, or we look at the United States, particularly when you look at great powers, all right, does realism still hold? Are they all disproportionately self-involved? Are they all disproportionately trying to win?
I think you look at the great three powers, and I think that realism kind of stands out. But then you look at the European Union, and you think more liberalism as a whole. I think that both could be argued, right? Like there's sides to both things, but I think that the great three powers still operate off of every man for himself.
All right. Well, what about does geopolitical realism in any way explain Brexit, for example? You have this referendum held in the UK, and as a consequence of that, they change prime ministers. They have this sort of kind of almost Trump-esque upheaval in domestic British politics. And then you have this deadline, and well, we can't quite do it because we are, after all, British, and we don't do anything on time, and they don't, and they screw it all up. And now, by the way, Halloween was supposed to be the cutoff. Obviously, I'm concerned about that because my youngest son is sitting in London right now with a Polish passport and an American passport. Would that be explained? Would the theory of realism in any way explain that? Or is it like, no, you got to look someplace else to be able to explain that?
I think, yeah, because they like part of the whole thing with the UK. So England wanting to, like the EU wanted UK to turn over to the euro, but UK wanted to watch out for themselves and keep the pound. So there you can kind of give the definition of realism. The UK kind of separated themselves with the European Union because of the water that was in between them. And so they felt like the interests of the EU were no longer theirs. And so when they don't have like that, we're going to help everybody else out so that we also rise at the same time. The Brexit could be explained by realism by saying that they were looking to expand quicker than the EU or get stronger faster than the EU was letting them.
But what about the internal politics of Brexit? What about all of the differences in terms of the way that referendum came out? Say the difference between Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland. I mean, there were significant differences in what the referendum results were in different parts of this arguably, under realism, unitary rational actor. Do you see where I'm going with this? I'm not at all trying to argue that anything that Micah is saying here is wrong, but is realism the best way to explain that? Doesn't it in part, let me push a little harder, doesn't it in part stem from fractions within the United Kingdom over what the direction of the UK should be with respect to the rest of the world? That doesn't sound like realism, unless I'm oversimplifying. Or is realism an oversimplification? How do we define, for example, the rationality of a nation state? How do we know when it's acting rationally? How do you know when the United States is acting rationally and when it's just doing something because the president's pissed off, which doesn't sound very rational? I mean, think about the United States and think about what passes for foreign policy. Because remember, this is concerned with foreign policy. The realism would suggest that there is some rationality. First, to the United States entering into extensive multi-party negotiations over what became the Iran nuclear deal, and then pulling away from it. That there's something rational about that. Is there? Or is it just as simple as one party or another controlling the state? Does realism seem to explain that?
I think it's difficult to fully say because I don't think that there's one theory that really responds to every single aspect of something. Like, that's why there's different theories, and that's why people are able to fight between realism and liberalism. All the different theories, they're just different. There's things that realism can answer, there's things that liberalism can answer, and even looking at one thing, you can't apply realism to every single aspect. Most of the time, I can't think of something that you can apply realism to every single aspect and be like, all right, it answers this, it answers that, it answers this, like everything.
Okay, we're not talking about a general theory of everything. First of all, you're right. This is not a general theory. Realism does not purport to be a general theory of everything. Okay, but let's look at the fundamental assumptions of realism. Okay, one of them is that the international environment is essentially anarchic. Okay, that there's no real central notion of good and bad or right and wrong. Okay, it's an environment of sustained conflict. Now, in that, we could argue that one way to mitigate that conflict, say from the point of view of the United States, would be to try to either prevent or discourage Iran from becoming a nuclear weapons state. Okay, do you see how there's a reason to that? It makes sense. It's rational. Okay, I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's rational. Remember, you can be rational and be mistaken if you have imperfect information. But the assumption, for example, of the Obama administration was, look, Iran doesn't really want to do this. It feels like it has to. Okay, why don't we make this easier for them? Why don't we unfreeze some of the assets that we've frozen for various reasons? Because Iran has been a naughty actor internationally, and we've frozen millions of dollars of economic assets, and because we have the power to do that, we've done it. We'll agree to unfreeze some of those things. That, by the way, is what Republicans, for at least the opportunistic ones, are talking about when they say, oh, and then Obama dumped suitcases full of money on the airports in Iran. That was their money. Okay, that's nonsense that somehow we bribed them. We didn't. It was their money. But when you negotiate, you got to give things. A negotiation isn't just people doing what you say. So we could argue that even though those negotiations resulted in a multinational deal, that there still is a logic of geopolitical realism behind it. In other words, the United States wasn't doing it because it was a nice thing to do, but it was in the interest of the United States to try to contain Iran as a potential nuclear threat in the Middle East. Because the understanding would be, what does Iran want that we don't want them to have? They want to be the regional power in the Middle East, right? We want Israel to be the regional power in the Middle East. And other than that, we want, for example, to exploit the inevitable conflict of that region to our advantage. We don't want any single Arab state to emerge as the dominant power in the Middle East. It's why, for example, think of geopolitical realism. If you go back to the Iran-Iraq war back in the 80s, in one way or another, the United States actually supported both sides in that war. Okay? It's a complicated history, but it is a fact on the ground that United States foreign policy in the Iran-Iraq war was to get them to fight to weaken both of them so that neither one of them in the aftermath of the war could emerge as a dominant Middle Eastern power. So we were projecting Israel, and by doing that, we were projecting our ability to project pro-United States force into a fundamentally unstable part of the world. That would be an explanation derived from geopolitical realism. Understand, there's no morality to that. There can be nothing moral about supporting both sides in a horrific war that involved the use of chemical agents and all kinds of things. There's no morality to that. Okay, do you see how that could be seen as an example that geopolitical realism can explain as a theory? Oh, I can explain why that happened. But the problem is, it assumes that this notion of conflict is constant and inevitable. It doesn't mean that everyone's always in conflict with everyone else all the time. There aren't enough great powers to do that. But certainly there's this constant pressure and counter pressure, this sort of global multiplayer chess game underway in the international arena to exploit weaknesses, take advantage of strengths, and project more and more of your interest and your power to the rest of the world. That would be geopolitical realism. But what I'm suggesting is that, well, realism may explain, it may do a wonderful job, of explaining wars. It may do a wonderful job of explaining the exercise of what's called diplomatic or soft power, but it doesn't necessarily do a very good job of explaining something like Brexit. It might not, because Brexit, most of what's happening with Brexit is domestic politics in Great Britain. In other words, no one was really threatening Great Britain. No one was threatening to go to war with them. Imposing regulations on an alliance of states equally, right, is not war, whatever else it is. But if you have a party that frames that, as the Conservative Party did in England, that frames it as sort of the moral or economic equivalent of warfare, what you're really doing is exploiting those fractions, not between nation states, but between interests within your own nation state, your own country, or your own, realm, in the case of the United Kingdom. I would suggest that in that sense, geopolitical realism doesn't help us. Okay? What about world systems theory? What is world systems theory? Because it's different. Again, start with the idea of what are the assumptions? The assumptions of geopolitical realism, a relatively anarchic international environment, a relatively constant state of contestation, conflict, self-interested advance of the interests of single nation states as unitary rational actors. Those are the basics of realism. What about world systems?
Like world systems in it. Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay.
I've already talked. I need to.
I just have down that the basic fundamentals to world systems theory had a lot to do with capitalism and economies and accumulating wealth by getting more wealth from other countries.
Well, that's a good start. Remember that geopolitical realism assumes that there's really no structure to the world. There's really no structure to the international environment. It's essentially, it's a free fire zone. World systems theory imposes a very rigid, deterministic structure on the whole world. That's the first difference that you should make note of, and I would certainly write that down. World systems theory imposes structure where geopolitical realism denies any coherent structure for the world, okay? That's really important. The structure that world systems theory as a theory imposes is global capitalism. In other words, global capitalism isn't just, the search for profit and market forces and all that kind of stuff. It imposes a power structure on the entire world. Capitalism is not a philosophy that some countries have and others don't. It is a geopolitical system. It is the geopolitical system. It is a structure. It's institutionalized globally. There's no, this stuff's not random, and it's not anarchic. It's all in the interest of maintaining and expanding global capitalism as a unifying world system, hence the term world system theory, okay? So that if you want to understand, for example, imbalances of power, you look at where countries are positioned within the global capitalist system. So that when you look at Russia, some people still insist that Russia is a great power. But when you really look at where Russia is positioned within global capitalism, the only thing they really have that the rest of the world wants is a largely primary commodity, energy, particularly oil. Okay, the problem with being an oil producer without a diverse economy and strong exports of other goods and services is that you are totally captive to the system of global capitalism as it relates to the price of oil. The price of oil fluctuates globally, not locally, globally. From the point of view of world systems theory. Does this make sense? Or am I losing you? So that actually means, from the point of view of power, that Russia is relatively weak. It's relatively dependent upon these fluctuations that largely out of its control, beyond its control in global energy prices. It's terrified, for example, Russia is terrified of the global trend away from fossil fuels because that's the one thing Russia has that Eastern and Western Europe want, fossil fuel energy. But if imagine Russia without, the same existing reliance on fossil fuel energy, what would they have? Compared, for example, to China, which is the factory floor of the world in terms of high quality manufacturing. It's China. Because they do it at a scale that far surpasses, for example, Germany, which is one of the manufacturing centers of the world. The United States used to be one of the manufacturing centers of the world. We've kind of deindustrialized. We talked earlier in the term about deindustrialization. Okay, so what world systems theory says is we have to reevaluate the real power of a country like Russia. Yeah, do they have the capacity to destabilize our elections a little bit, or say mean things, or go around saying they've got a cure for COVID-19 or a vaccine or whatever, and then we don't hear anything more about what happens with it? You see, that doesn't sound like a great power. It's like saying North Korea is a great power because it has nuclear weapons. It's not. It's a fourth-rate power. It doesn't even have first-rate weapons. We don't even know if any of their weapons work. Okay, so they.
Sir, did you just call North Korea a dictatorship a great power?
No, I didn't. I said that's why some people would say that North Korea is. I said it would be like calling North Korea a great power. And when I say great, Zachary, I got to remind you of this. You got to listen to what I'm saying. Great power means large, able to project force. It doesn't mean, gee, they're great folks over there. So just simmer down a little bit, man. We'll get there in the end, but we won't if you're not listening, okay? A great power is a power capable of projecting force at a seismic level. A lot of people.
So by that logic, Russia is a great power
because
it
cannot project force at a seismic level. It's shown its inability to do that.
Is that why the U.S. is afraid of Russia?
Because the United States isn't afraid of. The United States is not afraid of Russia. Geopolitically,
I'm sorry,
the
sir,
United-
but I feel like you don't know what you're talking about right there. I'm so sorry, but I feel like you know what you're talking about there. The U.S. has been afraid of Russia for almost 100 years now. Need I remind you of the Red Scare, of the Cold War, where we were afraid of Russia and their nuclear weapons? Hell, their president could take down any regular citizen.
Zachary, if you want to teach a class, I recommend you go and get a PhD. I do know what I'm talking about. The United States was not concerned about Russia. The United States was concerned about communism taking hold as an ideology in the United States and undermining capitalism. See, also, Zachary, you're forgetting what I'm doing here because you're not listening. I'm trying to argue from the vantage point of world systems theory. This is not Bill Hughes's personal theory. Okay? I'm trying to say a world systems theorist would argue that Russia, while powerful, is not really a transcendent great power. We don't really have to be afraid of them, except that inevitable uncertainty that an aspirant to great power that isn't a great power might be reckless. That's different from saying, oh my God, for a century they've been this global titan. No, they haven't. Especially if you take away nuclear weapons, but we know that a lot of their nuclear weapons didn't even work. We know their nuclear reactors don't work right. We know their nuclear submarines don't work right. We don't need to be afraid of them. We need to be cautious about them the way we are about a wounded animal. Okay, but a wounded animal isn't king of the jungle. Okay, that I'm thinking like a world
That's a cop-out.
theorist. You're not. I don't think you're listening. I'm trying to express a point of view informed by a specific theory. So when you say to me, I don't know what I'm talking about, you're not listening to what I'm trying to do. Okay, what I'm trying to do is say someone arguing from the point of view of world systems theory would critique the idea that Russia is truly a great power. Aspirant to great power, absolutely yes. China, great power, yes. United States, a great power, yes. Okay, because the determining structure is capitalism. And as a capitalist economy, Russia is weak. That's what a world systems theorist would say, not Bill Hughes personally. How many times have I said in here, my personal views are my own and I'm not teaching them?
The flaw of the capitalist system is exploited.
I'm sorry, say again?
Nope, sorry, that was my friend in the background. We're visiting because of the elections right now. But
Okay, cool.
why are you judging it based on capitalism, the weakest and most profoundly shown to be an ineffective system? Why is that?
Zachary, are you listening? Okay, it's really important. What were we going to talk about today? Two theories, geopolitical realism and world systems theory, not Bill Hughes theory. I have to show you how the theory works. The way I do that is to try and plug in existing world events and see if the theory explains anything. The problem here is that really you're more interested in trying to prove me wrong than you are in trying to learn a theory, which again, just as we did with geopolitical realism, we've already agreed these theories, none of them works perfectly. This is what, this is, I think, what Michael was talking about earlier, that none of these explain everything. We already know that. You don't need to help us with that. We already know that. And if you're arguing, for example, that capitalism is this incredibly weak economic system, that certainly doesn't explain why China didn't advance as a global power until economically they began to behave like capitalists. The argument is much more complex than that. What I'm trying to do is advance a theory by way of trying to teach it. I'm not trying to talk you into anything or warp your brain or embarrass you in front of your friends, okay? So can we please not have this kind of argument in here? It serves no productive purpose at all. It just doesn't help. It doesn't teach anything. I'm interested in teaching, not arguing. I'm not interested in convincing you or changing your mind. I'm not sure how many times I have to say that, but I'll keep saying it because I get paid to, okay? Now, if world systems argues, unlike realism, that no, there's a global structure, and since about, if you look at, say, Immanuel Wallerstein or Andre Günther Frank or some of the people who advanced this, that world capitalism really begins in the aftermath of the so-called voyages of discovery, right? So now we're into the 1600s. Okay, from that point onward, we see, according to world systems theory, that there's this consolidation of this predominant system of resource acquisition and exploitation. Resource acquisition and exploitation over and over and over, rinse and repeat. And that cycle of projection and exploitation has come to determine a global system. It determines trade, it determines economic growth, it determines prevailing views of what is or is not modern or what is or is not good, okay? And it determines geopolitical power. That's what world systems theory says, okay? Now, let's go to something like what Zachary was, I think, talking about, which would be, say, the Cold War. Could you explain the Cold War, this kind of bipolar antagonism, either using geopolitical realism or using world systems theory? The question would be, which one of those theories might offer a better explanation? So the geopolitical realist is going to say, well, this clearly, these were two countries who wanted to dominate the world. It's the ultimate contest. Who gets to rule the world? Who gets to project force around the world so profoundly as functionally to rule the world? That would be, in simple terms, that would be geopolitical realism. How would somebody using world systems theory explain that geopolitical bipolarity that, let's say, functionally really exists from 1945 through approximately 1989, 1990, and the demise of the Soviet Union? How would world systems theory explain that in a way that might be different from geopolitical realism, as something other than just two self-interested rational actors fighting it out and using surrogate wars and all this other stuff, proxy wars, all that? That there's another explanation. It has to do with, no, this is not an anarchic environment. There's a system here, and these two powers are fighting over control of it. That would be world systems theory. In other words, it would be a war to preserve and advance global capitalism, or to defeat it and create a new world system. That's why things like the creation of the Comintern make a lot of sense. That's why the Soviet Union sending nuclear weapons to Cuba makes a lot of sense, because it's so that this little tiny country 90 miles away from the United States can have a lethal threat directed against the United States. It's not to liberate the people of Cuba, it's to crush global capitalism by destabilizing the largest economy in the world. That's how a world systems theorist might explain that, I think. In other words, it's a struggle over, contained within this global system of capitalism, but the consolidation of communist leadership in Russia, and then a kind of communist rival power in China, and then these ancillary communist powers, right, in the Eastern Bloc and places like Cuba, and ultimately perhaps, I don't even know if I really include Nicaragua as a communist power. They were certainly socialist, but I don't think that under Ortega that they were really communist, notwithstanding what the Reagan administration was saying. What you're trying to do is, can I come up with an explanation so that this makes more sense than it would if I compared it to another explanation? Think of this as the same way people think when they think about a theory like evolution. Is there a better way to explain, the origin and existence of species on the planet right now, given all the data we have, the fossil record and everything else? Is there a better explanation than evolution? One that's actually in the money, that people say, no, you know what, this explains things better. I don't think there is. I can't think of one. But what we're arguing here is that there might be times when, and I think this is what Micah was trying to suggest, there might be times when realism seems to explain something that's going on. There might be times when world systems theory might be what we want to go to. If that's what we're doing, though, then it kind of suggests that neither of those theories might be have as much explanatory power as we might have thought. Okay, so when you think about world systems theory, think about that idea of a global system. as opposed to chaos. All right, questions or comments? Am I right in assuming that, particularly with respect to world systems theory, almost none of you have read that? Is that a fair assumption? See, I can't tell because almost everybody's camera's shut off, which means you're all sitting there drinking beer.
No,
Except that you're
I
not,
did
because you
read
don't drink. Yeah, all right.
I did.
Tequila, actually.
So again, world systems theory, fundamental assumptions. If you click on the link, this is an easy one. Okay, it's important that it emerges out of an era of revolution. The first sentence tells us that. In other words, the idea is people were looking at Latin America and they were asking themselves, you know, these countries in Latin America have been independent about as long as the United States, right? Because the great decolonization of Latin America was pretty much consolidated by about 1820 in formal terms, okay? And there was some instability that followed that. But if you think about it, I mean, the United States was still consolidating its independence in 1860, and we had a civil war over it. But they looked at them and they thought, well, they're independent, they're members of the United Nations, they're this and they're that, but look at their economies, they're all unstable and they're maladaptive and everything else. What's going wrong here? Why are they, why can't they make the changes that you would think they would need to make in order to be more economically diverse and resilient? One of the theories that came up was a theory of what's called dependency. And it was that these, from the time of their, in fact, predating their independence, as former colonial possessions of Europe, and in the way that they were decolonized, that they remained largely economically dependent on a European center of the economy. That sort of, the United States and Western Europe are this sort of center of this global system, capitalism. For the most part, Latin America has been left out of that center. So it's in what's sometimes called the periphery, all right? And the relations economically that define these Latin American countries are relations of dependency. They're dependent upon the fluctuation in global prices, largely for the primary goods they produce. We saw a lot of people talking about, one of the theories was import substitution was going to be a big thing. So it was import substitution industrialization, sometimes called ISI. The idea that if these countries want to stabilize and grow and have better ways of life for their people and better education, everything else, right? They need to stop being dependent upon an economic core for their finished goods. They need to start producing those finished goods themselves, because countries that produce finished manufactured goods also produce relatively high-paying, middle-class wage jobs. They grow their middle class. You grow the middle class, you stabilize the society more. You stabilize an economy. You get more participation. Again, it's this idea of stabilizing things and then growing in a stable way, because they were all being compared to the United States. Because everybody says, well, they decolonized at about the same time as the United States. Why do they look so different? Some people had cultural explanations. They said, well, it's because that these are Latin countries. And I mean, you actually heard things like this. The temperament is different. They didn't have the same work ethic. There were all these kinds of things, many of them just blatantly bigoted. What the dependency theorists were saying is, no, you know what? The more we look at this, the more we realize they've never really been given the opportunity to have the kind of real economic self-determination that would allow them to do this. They've never had the capital, or they've never had control of it. They've always been marginalized by other powerful industrial capitalist countries. So this is why the threat of the Soviet Union was not them as a power coming and kicking our asses. It was them convincing Latin America and Southeast Asia and places like that that their system was superior to this world capitalist system because it wouldn't underdevelop them. That would allow them to develop. It would allow them, to join into this larger solidarity and partnership with all the other, socialist states. And, that's why it's important that socialism is internationalized, that calling something National Socialism is essentially calling it fascism. Okay. And so the idea was, you're fighting fascism. The United States is a fascist country. Great Britain's a fascist country. West Germany is a fascist country. This is before unification, right? Because they are exploiting you and keeping you dependent. So this was a critique of world capitalism. This whole idea was, the problem isn't the lifestyle of, Spanish-speaking countries, or in the case of Brazil, a Portuguese-speaking country. The problem is not, ethnic heterogeneity. It's not that they can't resolve the differences internally. The problem is capitalism, because capitalism is a world system. There's not a Brazilian capitalism and an American capitalism and a British capitalism. There's capitalism, and more powerful countries enter into and dominate that system. Weaker countries are exploited by that system. They produce cheap labor, they produce raw materials that feed the engine of world capitalism, but they never experience the stability and growth of the Western capitalist countries, okay? So this is a very revolutionary theory. Even though not everybody who advanced it was a Marxist, a lot of it was informed by a kind of Marxist logic about, critiquing capitalism and that kind of stuff, okay? So to make sense of it, again, and particularly to draw a contrast between this and something like realism, the sharpest contrast is that geopolitical realism presumes absolutely no structure or order to the world. World systems theory imposes a relatively rigid, well-defined structure characterized by the exploitative nature of global capitalism, right? So that's the main thing I wanted you to kind of start to understand, is that those are very different ways of looking at the world, okay? If you had to decide between one or the other of them, which one sounds more compelling to you and why? In other words, when you think of the assumptions, would you first argue that the world is sort of more chaotic, or the world is really more characterized by variations in the integration to a single capitalist economic system? Which one sounds more plausible to you? Is there chaos or is there order?
I feel like for the most part, chaos.
Chaos? Okay. Are the most powerful countries capitalist or non-capitalist?
I mean, an argument could be made that they're more of an oligarchy, but overall they are pretty capitalist.
Well, I think, Zachary, I think you could argue globally that there is a global oligarchy. If that's what you're saying, you're absolutely right. In other words, that's what world systems theory says. There's a global oligarchy. It's the Western industrial capitalist countries. Yeah. But you see, an oligarchy presupposes a singular system, right? At the top of which are the oligarchs. That's not a bad way of thinking about it as a theory, sure. So that would suggest that, well, no, world systems theory imposes this structure and this order that prevents some countries from emerging as other powers, on an equal footing, and keeps them as these subservient powers that are kind of dependent for, their future on the will of what Zachary would refer to as a global oligarchy. Is that, am I interpreting you right there, Zachary?
I think you are. Would an example of that be like, I can't name one off the top of my head, but like one of the South American countries that the U.S. has superimposed a dictator onto, to where that ends up helping the oligarchical system of
Yes.
things like Monsanto or McDonald's and whatnot?
Yes, yeah, that would be, yes, that would be the sort of radical leading edge of world systems theory would be, when we helped install Augusto Pinochet, or somebody like that, and we did that any number of times, right? When we fought to protect Batista or somebody like that, as opposed to allowing, Castro to take over, when we fought so hard, first against Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and then even harder against his successor, Maduro, right? That we were doing that as an imperative of global capitalism. That what we were really fighting for was the protection of global capitalism as a system over which we could exert oligarchic dominance. Yeah, that's not a bad way of looking at that at all. You see the difference, though, between arguing and projecting a theory. We don't know yet if we're right, but we're trying to see, can we make this theory sing? We might decide, no, we really can't. But if we can, then all we're thinking is, well, is that the best explanation I have, or do I need to look at another theory? So yeah, if you could actually think of global capitalism as a unified system that, just like in a society that has an oligarchy that controls it, there's a global oligarchy. There's a global terms of order. There's, there are global powerful, only a few of those, and then there are global not very powerful. Okay. But here's the thing about world systems and dependency theory. What do you do with a country like Portugal? Is Portugal core, that is, the oligarchs, or is it periphery? Because remember, the first major maritime power that really started the voyage of discovery was Portugal. But I don't think anybody thinks of Portugal as a great power. The last of the European colonial powers to relinquish its colonial possessions was the weakest of all of them, Portugal, in 1975. And yet, does that fit into the world systems theory notion of a core of the leaders who go out and exploit, and those who are exploited by them? What does it say about a country like Portugal? It wasn't colonized in the same way that Latin America was. In fact, particularly when you look at Brazil, it was a colonizing power. But I don't think anybody thinks of it as part of an oligarchy now, or a dominant. It's not dominant in global capitalism. How do you explain something like that? You could say the same thing about Spain. Remember those hundreds of years when Spain was a vast, powerful world enterprise, bent on world domination, and the big galleons bringing all that gold and wealth back from the so-called New World. And the Spanish monarchy was incredibly powerful, and it was a formidable force in war on land and sea and all that. Yeah. Or Britain. Britain's kind of a, they're not what they once were. There is no more British Empire. It's over. So one of the critiques of world systems is that by really leaning into this system of global capitalism, and this is just a critique, I don't think it obviates the theory, but it is a legitimate critique. It's a static theory, but it doesn't explain the many times when we've seen countries that were once powerful recede into something very like the periphery, but they're not former colonies. One of the responses to that was to the creation of another sphere called the semi-periphery. And the semi-periphery would include two kinds of powers. One of them would be once great powers that have receded. That would be Spain and Portugal in particular, but others as well. The other would be once completely marginalized colonial powers that are now sort of in the global middle class. And that would be Singapore, Taiwan, if you see it as independent, obviously South Korea, some of these other countries. The idea being there is some movement that can occur, if not all the way from the periphery to the core, at least from the periphery to a kind of semi-periphery, okay, where you are significantly better off and more powerful and better placed within global capitalism than you were when you were merely a colony or a third-rate power, or a completely, captive power. So world systems theorists have tried to kind of refine that theory. Some people would argue that the more they've tried to refine it, the more they're really conceding that it doesn't work. That, that it just doesn't explain enough. There are too many exceptions to the rules that it more or less rigidly imposes on our understanding of the world. So that would be world systems theory. Okay. Now, here's an important thing. Neither one of these theories relies upon culture. It really doesn't. Culture is a secondary, or what Marx would call a superstructural epiphenomenon. It's just sort of, it's not really anything you need to worry about. It's just radiation. It's not really the core of things. That the core of things for geopolitical realism is collision, right? Contestation, power. The only thing that matters in realism is power, the constant aspiration to more power. World systems theory would suggest that the only thing that matters is where you are positioned in global capitalism as a system. So then we get to these theories that I want you to look at for our next class. And I'd like you to look at the Clash of Civilizations. Okay, if you click on that link, it's a Wikipedia. So it's, come on, this is your world. But it's not a really bad summary of it. It's actually quite good. The first thing you'll notice is that it doesn't presuppose a single world system. And it also doesn't presuppose anarchy. It sees pretty established realms. And there's a game that's being played. But it's not a game about capitalism, and it's not just a game about Machiavellian power. So what I want you to think about before a Monday, right? Remembering that next Wednesday there's no class, right? Is if the fundamental assumption of geopolitical realism is a power struggle amidst an environment of anarchy, and if the fundamental assumption of world systems theory would be a struggle to maintain and dominate and exploit within a relatively clearly articulated system of global capitalism, then what's the fundamental assumption of the Clash of Civilizations? That's what I want you to be able to tell me by Monday. You got plenty of time to do that. Okay? Now, are there any questions? This is a lot of stuff. Most of these theories can be understood at a fairly rudimentary level if you don't fight with them. If you try and figure out, not do you believe them, but is there a logic to them that you can understand? Because if you can understand the logic of any theory, then and only then are you really ready to critique it. You can't just dismiss something because you don't like the sound of it. But if you find, well, they're telling me that this is the logic of the world, and I'm thinking of all these examples where it doesn't fit, then you're on your way to being able to critique that theory. And maybe you won't come up with a better one because you might not be interested, but at least you're not going to be persuaded, or at least not as easily. Okay?
Why and how is culture secondary if most of Western history is based upon superimposing white and European culture onto other people to try and force them into places that the rich class can move them in? How is culture secondary when the very first thing that an invading power does is try to superimpose their culture onto the people they're trying to usurp?
Well, no, I would say that's not quite accurate historically. First of all, that the imperative of an invading country is not to superimpose a new culture. It's to crush opposition to resistance.
Literally all Native Americans that we tortured, killed, made them denounce their gods and accept the Christian God in order to make them do what we wanted. All of American history and Western history, I point you to all of Africa, is based upon superimposing one's own culture onto the people they were trying to invade. That's all of basically white history, is trying to superimpose culture. So how is culture secondary?
Okay, first of all, I'm not saying culture is secondary. I'm saying from the point of view of these two theories, culture is secondary. I hope we're not going to start that same argument again. I'm trying to argue from the point of view of these cultures. The reason why I want you to read Clash of Civilizations is because that is a theory, insofar as it stands up, that purports to answer Zachary's question by putting culture at the center of things. Okay, so that would be my response. Again, try to remember, it's not just Zachary, but everybody, these are not my personal views, but I explained early on in the class that the way that I teach is I try to internalize these theories or these concepts and argue from that point of view to give you something, you know, either, okay, here's what this theory sounds like when someone's thinking that way, but also, yeah, to give you something to push against. But I'm not trying to convince you of any of these things. That's not my job. I don't know why people think that that would be the job of a teacher, to try to convince you that you're wrong and I'm right. That's what you do when you're arguing in a bar. And you guys are going to have to buy me some really nice beer if you want to do that, because, you know, I got better things to do. But look, you know, Zachary, look at the Clash of Civilizations and see if that addresses your concern about the centrality of culture. It might not, but even if it doesn't, it might help you understand why it doesn't. Maybe there are other assumptions in there that don't square with that perspective of history that you're advancing. And then you have to decide, is my perspective of history right? Or do I need to revise my perspective of history? But that's a decision for every one of you as an individual to make. You know, you're just going to have to decide that. Okay. And then I'd like you to look at this notion of liberal internationalism. Okay. It's relatively short. It's easy to skim, but what's meant by liberal internationalism is something that I'd like you to be aware of. So for Monday, the main one I want you to try to get, and please spend some time with this one, is the Clash of Civilizations. You know, put more time into it than what you've put into it coming into today. Okay. Because you don't have an assignment hanging over your heads right now, so you have more time to do this. And that, you know, I understand that, but take a look at, obviously, some of you haven't yet, take a look at realism, take a look at world systems theory in the context of what we've talked about. But then when you look at Clash of Civilizations, the best way to learn a theory is not to argue with it. The best way to learn a theory is to learn the theory. Okay, and again, try to identify its core assumptions and its internal logic. Don't try to dispute them. First, try to identify them. It's just not enough to say, well, all these people are wrong because I see the world differently. Try to understand the logic of the theory. Okay. Then you can deal with the theory as something that has a mechanical flaw to it. You can say, well, your reasoning isn't solid here because of these specific case studies. Okay. I would even argue that in Zachary's argument about the United States and indigenous Americans, that, you know, early on, there was little or no interest in having anything to do with Native Americans. Even in the Constitution, you can see they're considered an outlier. Okay, there was no great attempt to religiously convert on the part of the East Coast of the United States. There was much more interest in just getting them the hell off the land. The real conversion initially was from the Spanish as a Catholic empire. Okay, but I would suggest that it's just as much of an error of logic to assume that every European power went about the business of colonizing in the same way. Clearly, that's not true. Race is
All of Africa would disagree with you.
interesting. Okay. Let's pick this up on next Monday. I think I'm done. I think I'm really done. All right. Anything else? Well, now that all of Africa has disagreed with me, I think I need to go on and just rethink every fundamental assumption of my entire life, which I presumably will be able to do sometime before Monday. All right. I'll see you then.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.